everyone! Yeah, I know. It's been a while since I've made these. But to be fair, that Flash video took a lot out of me. Plus, there's also been a lot of developments in the intermediate time, such as apparently how the fact that apparently Stephen King has seen an early screening of the movie and apparently really enjoyed that. Plus, there have been several early screenings throughout the United States and also other countries, and people have been loving it and been giving me a really good word of mouth. But that is neither here nor there. You see, rather, I'm going to be doing something interesting, and I'm actually going to be giving you guys 2 reviews that are going to be coming this week. The first one, as you can see, I am uploading now, will be, well, talking about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, because even though the movie had released, like, slightly less than a month ago now at this point, I still really want to talk about it for very obvious reasons. And then the next video, which will hopefully release tomorrow after I publish this, the day after I publish this video, is when I will be uploading my review of Across the Spider-Verse. So get excited for that. And currently I have my laptop with me here because I have a set of talking points and main things that I really want to be able to address. And it's also that way I don't, go off topic and I don't stray too far, and the video isn't that hour-long monstrosity that is my History of Flash video. So there's that. So, without any further dilly-dallying, let's get into my review of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. Now, what is the actual premise of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, for those unaware? Well, the premise of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 follows the Guardians as they're, continuing to do what they do best, and that's guard the galaxy. Peter Quill, aka Star-Lord, played once again by Chris Pratt, is still struggling to get over the loss of Gamora after she was killed by Thanos during the events of Avengers Infinity War. Even more so when a mysterious time-displaced doppelganger has appeared of Gamora from Endgame as well. And so now it's like she's still there, but she just doesn't remember Peter or the experiences that they've had together. But then things end up taking a turn when the Guardians end up facing a threat from Rocket's past. The High Evolutionary, played by, hold on, let me look up how to pronounce his name. Chukwudi Iwuji, I think is his name. But he played Clem Zimmerman in Peacemaker, as the High Evolutionary seeks to claim Rocket, and the Guardians must do whatever they can to protect Rocket, even if it potentially means the disbanding of this incarnation of the Guardians. Now, some background information. I was 9 years old when I watched the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie. I didn't see it in theaters, but I got it as a Christmas present when it released on Blu-ray in the summer of 2014. In fact, this was the very first MCU movie that I had ever seen. I'd of course grown up with the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, and also I watched the Andrew Garfield Spider-Man movies. ASM, Amazing Spider-Man 2, was like the first comic book movie I remember watching in the theater at that point. But Guardians was the first ever MCU film I saw, and from that moment on, I've been a huge fan of the MCU throughout its many ups and downs. And obviously, of course, the Guardians have held a very special soft spot in my heart. The first Guardians movie might be my favorite MCU film ever, and I have a huge amount of love for Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. I actually think it's probably one of the many superior Marvel Part 2s compared to a lot of, the other ones. James Gunn also happens to be one of the best writers and directors working in the comic book sphere right now. Not just on the Guardians movies, but also with the Suicide Squad and Peacemaker. Both of those projects were fantastic, by the way. And obviously he's just one of my favorite writers and directors in general, because I've seen a lot of his other stuff, before he did Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, I've seen the live-action Scooby-Doo movies that he wrote. Like, I've watched Super, surprisingly enough. I watched the kill count for Slither, but I haven't actually, watched the movie itself yet, but I will probably get around to it. But yeah. Now, James Gunn initially was actually, for those who don't know, fired from the production of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 because a group of alt-right trolls tried to be able to get Gunn fired by revealing old tweets that Gunn had made back in the past. They tried to get him fired, and he did get fired from Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. However, eventually, like a couple of months later, like the day he got hired to do the Suicide Squad, the head of Disney and Marvel were like, hey man, we were really impressed with your response to this whole situation. We were actually wondering if there might be a chance you'd be interested in coming back to direct Guardians 3. but obviously his hands were clearly tied with the Suicide Squad and then later the Peacemaker TV series. So obviously that's why this movie has taken at least a good 6 years to get made, because not only has Gunn needed the time in order to perfect the script, but also because he was busy with literally another entire movie and TV series. That can kind of get in the way of things. But from the offset, from the moment that this movie was announced, James Gunn mentioned this was going to be not only his last Marvel movie, but it was also going to be the last ever movie with this incarnation of the Guardians. So Star-Lord, Gamora, Drax, Rocket, Groot, Nebula, Kraglin, and new additions like Cosmo, this is going to be their last movie. This is going to be the last time we're going to ever see this incarnation of the Guardians together. And by golly, this was about as perfect and definitive a conclusion you could have possibly had. First off, I want to talk about the story. I love the fact that it has a greater emphasis on Rocket and his past, as the Guardians tend to protect him for the High Evolutionary, will also come to terms whether or not they'll continue to stick together. Because Gunn has mentioned the fact that Rocket is probably his favorite character out of all the Guardians to write for, very much viewing the character and himself as one and the same. In fact, you could make the argument the fact that even though this movie started out with Star-Lord and focused on his journey, Rocket might have actually been the secret protagonist of the Guardians movies this whole time. It just finally became known with Guardians Volume 3. In fact, Gunn himself mentioned that when he was initially fired, that out of all the elements he would have been bummed not to have fully finished, it would have been completing Rocket's story arc that he was establishing from Guardians 1 to Guardians 2, Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, and then finally Volume 3. Oh, and then also the holiday special in between Endgame and Volume 3, because sometimes I forget about that. But, you know, it is fun. Another thing I also want to mention how this movie's tone feels very different compared to the first two Guardians movies. There's a lot more of a feeling of finality and a lot more of a somber mood to it. That isn't to say the fact that there isn't still humor or joyous moments, far from it. It just feels like the fact that this movie has a lot more of a serious tone than one might expect with these Guardians movies. In fact, you immediately know the fact that this movie is going to be different from the other Guardians movies when the opening song that they use to, you know, obviously open the movie with is an acoustic version of the song Creep by Radiohead. But despite that darkness and despite that somberness, especially with Rocket's past, the movie also manages to be incredibly uplifting too, as it showcases the fact that we're not defined by our pasts, but our capacity for good and what makes us human in the present day. Now, while I don't think that this might be James Gunn's best script overall, like I think his script on Guardians, on the Suicide Squad, and maybe even some scripts he wrote for Peacemaker might be better, but I do think that this is probably the best script he's done with the Guardians characters. And I do think the fact that this is probably his best directorial work, as it manages to combine all the drama and humor that you would expect from a James Gunn project, but it feels like that over the years as Gunn has grown and matured, you can feel that approach in his Guardians movies. You can feel with each passing film the growth and the maturity of its writer and director. Because the first Guardians released back in 2014, almost 10 years ago. Obviously, the person who you were 10 years ago is not going to be the exact same person who you are now. And that very much is representative of the work you produce. And in fact, I'd actually even make the argument that this probably might be James Gunn's most emotionally mature work to date. Yeah, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3. And another thing that I want to mention off the bat is the cast. All the performances from everybody around were superb. Whether major or minor, they each had a really great moment to shine, either comedically or emotionally. But for me, there were three major standouts in this movie. One, we have Chris Pratt as Star-Lord. Obviously, of course, I really liked the direction that we see Quill take in the movie, of him learning how to be able to move past the death of Gamora while still trying to lead the Guardians, and maybe also working on himself. Rocket, obviously, voiced by Bradley Cooper and motion captured by Sean Gunn, was incredible as, you know, as I mentioned beforehand, not only do we see Rocket's past explored further in this movie, but we also get to see the character arc that Gunn had planned out for Rocket fulfilled ever since the beginning of Volume 1. And being able to see Rocket take the center stage and seeing how this is his story, his stakes, and seeing it how it come to a close was just incredible. And then we have Chukwudi Iwuji as the film's main villain, the High Evolutionary. He did great work. Like, this might be one of the best Marvel villain performances ever, purely because there is no redeeming qualities about the High Evolutionary. He is an incredibly narcissistic piece of garbage who has this god complex that you just so desperately want to see Rocket and the other Guardians take down. In fact, I don't know if this is actually true, but I remember I saw an article that mentioned either Iwuji or Gunn or both of them mentioned when they were crafting the High Evolutionary, they wanted to make sure the fact that he was void of the sympathetic qualities in the other villains like Killmonger or Vulture in all these other Marvel movies as well. And you know immediately what this guy's whole thing is all about when later in the movie, somebody is talking with him and somebody mentions something about God and he goes, "There is no God! That's why I stepped in!" And immediately from that one line, you know what this character is all about. Then there's Will Poulter as Adam Warlock. Now, I know people have been asking for Gunn to include Adam Warlock in the Guardians basically since the first movie's announcement, since Warlock is a very major player in the Marvel cosmic side of things in the comics. The thing is, I think that the version of Warlock that is shown here in the movie, it is not the comic version of Adam Warlock. And I think that in regards to the context of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 and the greater Marvel Cinematic Universe, I think Will Poulter did a really good job. But to me, it's very much like the same argument that I had for Taskmaster in Black Widow, in which, in the context of the movie it was in, it worked, but in terms of being an accurate representation of the character, you're going to be very disappointed. And another thing that I also want to commend Gunn for is how he was able to incorporate Gamora into the movie. Obviously, of course, as I mentioned beforehand, Gamora was unsanctimoniously killed in Avengers Infinity War, and then, of course, we have the time-displaced doppelganger in Endgame. In fact, Christopher Marcus and Steve Feely, the screenwriters of Infinity War and Endgame, specifically mentioned that the reason why they brought back that version of Gamora was because they knew that Gunn wanted to use her in Volume 3. And this is a bit of a spoiler because of the character arc that Gamora has in the movie, because she's with the Ravengers now and not the Guardians. And I do like the fact that the version of Gamora that we see here, she isn't the version of Gamora that we saw in Guardians Volume 1 and 2 and Infinity War. This is a completely different person now. And I like the idea of the fact that Quill had to accept the fact that the woman that he loved really is gone and that he has to move on. And while it is a bummer, sometimes that's just the way things are. Sometimes the people that you remember loving aren't the same people they are now. And you just need to be able to learn to move past that. And while, yes, it is and many people have talked up the wazoo about how terrible Gamora's death was in Infinity War, along with Black Widow's death in Endgame, I do think the fact that Gunn was able to incorporate Gamora in Volume 3 really well, and in a way that made sense to the character that we see in the context of the greater MCU. Now, is this movie flawless? No, it's not. And one problem that I do have with this movie is the pacing. The film itself is 2.5 hours long, which is the longest out of any of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies by a mile. And because of that, and it does feel like the fact that there are some moments that maybe drag on for a little bit longer than they probably should. And there's also the fact that there are so many characters in this movie. When you're dealing with big ensemble pieces like this, there will often be times where when you're focused on this particular group over here, because you're the ones watching them on screen, and you know, you're focusing on theirs, on their struggles and them trying to overcome these challenges, when it cuts back to another group of characters later on in the movie, you're like, oh my gosh, I almost forgot that these guys were actually in the movie. And obviously, of course, you know, as I mentioned, almost every character does get some moment to really shine, either in a comedic moment or in an emotional moment. And obviously, of course, you know, whether or not it's fully satisfactory, you know, is entirely up to the viewer. But I personally got the fact that the moments that each Guardian was able to get was really well fitting and very much a perfect send-off to them, you know, as characters. But when all is said and done, like, in terms of my overall thoughts on the movie, this truly is one of the greatest, like, not just Marvel movies, but one of the best comic book movies I've ever seen. Because never have I watched a movie that has such a level of definitive finality like this movie. Well, maybe Toy Story 3, but that was like 13 years ago. That was a very long time ago. Like, this was very much a movie that knew very much from the onset, this was the end, and this is the story that we are going to tell. And you know what? For the final installment of the Guardians of the Galaxy trilogy, this was about as perfect a conclusion you could possibly get. Performances were excellent. The visuals were top-notch. A lot of really great practical effects and really inventive imagery involved in this movie. The music choices I thought were really fantastic. Obviously, I really love the opening moment in which you see Rocket walking around to Radiohead in the opening. And then, of course, there are other moments too, like the No Sleep Till Brooklyn hallway fight was amazing. And the ending moment with Florence and the Machine's dog, Days Are Over, was a great moment of celebration that really capped off the ending of the Guardians, at least this incarnation of the Guardians, really, really, really well. And if this is the kind of stuff that we can expect James Gunn to bring to Superman Legacy, then bring that on, because I'm so excited to see what James Gunn is going to be doing for the future of whatever he is planning on doing movie, TV-wise. And the fact that he is the co-CEO of DC Studios now, and he's not only writing and directing a Superman movie, but is also currently working on so many other projects, like an animated TV show like Creature Commandos, which is going to usher in this new DC universe, a Peacemaker spin-off series focusing on Amanda Waller, then there's Peacemaker Season 2, and also helping to overview and oversee all of these other different projects like The Brave and the Bold, Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, Swamp Thing, a Booster Gold TV series, a movie based on The Authority. James Gunn has a lot of plans, and I am very much excited to see whatever he has next planned. But as for now, for discussions on this tenure over at Marvel, I am really going to miss Gunn, and I am really going to miss these versions of the Guardians. Obviously, of course, I grew up with them. I love them so much. But, you know, as Tony Stark once said, part of the journey is the end. So, and you know what? As I mentioned beforehand several times throughout this video, this was about as perfect and as satisfying an ending and a conclusion you could have possibly gotten with this film. So, yeah, 2 big thumbs up from me. Tune in later when I'm going to be giving you a review of Across the Spider-Verse, because if you thought I had a lot to say on Guardians Volume 3, oh boy, you have no idea what I'm going to be you have no idea the amount of time I'm going to be taking to be talking about Across the Spider-Verse. So, look forward to that. But until then, make sure to subscribe, like the video, share if you can, hit the notification bell so that way you don't miss out on all future uploads. Comment down below if you would like me to review something, because I'm happy to take suggestions as long as they're not too inappropriate, to say the least. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed. As I made mention earlier, stay tuned for my review for Across the Spider-Verse later this week. And as always, stay gold.